No, that's all good. I'll try and share my screen now. Hopefully it doesn't all fall to bits. So, can I see you all again? Can everyone see that?
Yeah.
Cool. So there's quite a small group. So from my perspective, please just ask questions whenever you want to. I'll try and leave some space at the end for questions, but as you go, if there's questions that come up, please do shout. So I guess the first thing to say is from a systems thinking perspective, systems thinking is not that new in its rawest form. It started out with Edward Deming way back, and people like Russ Adcock have worked on it, Peter Senge. So there's quite a lot of people who've been in and around systems thinking. The one that we specifically have focused on is probably nearest to the work done by John Seddon. So John was an occupational psychologist by background, but actually spent most of his life studying service organisations to work out what went wrong and what didn't. So this is very much based on the Vanguard method and John Seddon's work, although we've adapted it as appropriate for us. So if we think about what is systems thinking, so systems thinking always takes the customer perspective, and it's not a process view. It takes the customer perspective for building organizations front to back, top to bottom. So it looks at how do I understand the world from a customer lens, and then build everything in relation to that. And it does that through lots and lots of study, similar to what you would do with Lean or Six Sigma. So lots of calls, lots and lots of case reviews, sat with people trying to understand what's going on. But rather than most change, which I think when we're young, we're taught to break things to bits, to look at the bits, and then to try and put them back together to understand problems. Whilst there are component parts, systems thinking believes that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. So we're really interested in how things interact and what that broader system looks like. So with any luck, I've got a video for you now, just to try and mix things up, which is a really good example of what happens. Hang on, I'm just going to change that quickly. What can happen if you don't take a systems thinking view of the world? Quickly. I'm hoping you can all see and hear that.
No, that's not showing for me at the moment. I don't know
it's not showing.
else.
Hang on, let's pause that. I've done something wrong with the technology, I think. So why am I not going into out this?
Are you
No, I've got it. It's me being stupid, sorry.
Right.
The picnic, I think, is the same. Problem in the chair, not the computer. So now, everyone hear that?
In the 1950s, the Dayak people of Borneo, an island in Southeast Asia, were suffering from an outbreak of malaria, so they called the World Health Organization for help. The World Health Organization had a ready-made solution, which was to spray copious amounts of DDT around the island. With the application of DDT, the mosquitoes that carried the malaria were knocked down, and so was the malaria. There were some interesting side effects, though. The first was that the roofs of people's houses began to collapse on their heads. Turns out the DDT not only killed off the malaria-carrying mosquitoes, but it also killed a species of parasitic wasp that had controlled a population of thatch-eating caterpillars. Thatch being what the roofs of the Dayak people's homes were made from. Without the wasps, the caterpillars multiplied and flourished and began munching their way through the villagers' roofs. That was just the beginning. The DDT affected a lot of the island's other insects, which were eaten by the resident population of small lizards called geckos. The biological half-life of DDT is around 8 years, so animals like geckos do not metabolize it very fast. It stays in their system for a long time. Over time, the geckos began to accumulate pretty high levels of DDT, and while they tolerated the DDT fairly well, the island's resident cats, which dined on the geckos, did not. The cats ate the geckos, and the DDT contained in the geckos killed the cats. With the cats gone, the island's population of rats came out to play. We all know what happens when rats multiply and flourish. Pretty soon the Dayak people were back on the phone to the World Health Organization, only this time it wasn't malaria that was the problem. It was the plague and the destruction of their grain stores, both of which were caused by the overpopulation of rats. This time though, the World Health Organization didn't have a ready-made solution and had to invent one. What did they do? They decided to parachute live cats into Borneo. Operation Cat Drop occurred courtesy of the Royal Air Force and eventually stabilized the situation.
If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe.
So apologies for the lack of technological ability, but hopefully that gives a good idea about when we're looking at things, do we look at them as a whole, as a system, or do we look at actually component parts of it? So the first job from a systems thinking perspective, and I'm sure you've all seen this before, is because of the way we design organizations, people tend to have a view of their part of the organization. So the first job of systems thinking is to help people see the whole elephant, to understand actually it's not a rope like the guy behind, it's not a snake or a tree trunk like the guys in front, or the guy right at the back. I'm not sure what he thinks it is, but it's none of that. It's about trying to see the whole thing so we can start to see how to take action. So from an organizational perspective, what do we mean by system? So bearing in mind, I said to you, we always take an outside-in view. You start with customer demand and you think about outcomes for customers. And in the middle then there's a load of stuff which impacts how we have designed our system to create those outcomes for customers. And those can be from measures to how leaders act on the system, to prices, to the way that we think about capacity. Everything goes into the system. It's not a technology thing to think about. So we have to try to look at the organization from the outside, from a customer perspective, and try and work out what's going on as work flows through the system. So this is a really good example for me of a system. So when I think about an almost perfect system, you might think about a human body. So with a human body, if you go for a walk, then it's really simple. You decide to go for a walk, you get up, you put your shoes on, and off you go. But what would happen if they gave it to us as an organization? So we'd have a CEO who might be the head. We'd have a director of organs, a director of bones. Below that, we'd have heads of arms, lungs, hearts, as you can see on the chart. And below that, then we'd have managers for the different parts of the bones, managers for the different parts of the heart, all the way down to, you know, manager for the bones in the left foot, the right foot. But we design an organization that would be our representation of how the human body works. So when the CEO decides he wants to go for a walk, what's he going to be doing? He's going to be having a meeting with his team. And that might happen weekly, monthly, where he gets his exec together. So he gets them together and he says, right, guys, we need to go for a walk. And they all then cascade that through their team. Some might have, meetings a few weeks later. They might organize WebExes and phone-ins. They might cascade it through their one-to-ones. But all of a sudden, time takes a long time for us to do these very simple things as we try and navigate through the organizational structure. But it's not just that, is it? Because if the heart's got a measure which says don't go above 90 beats per minute, yet the muscles all of a sudden want to be the next Arnold Schwarzenegger, then they're going to be competing all the time. Just the same as if the left and the right foot were competing for the next job, what would happen? They'd be competing with each other as they go. So much as far away from creating this perfect human system where you can go for a walk, we'd be lucky in our organizational terms if we created something like a stumbling zombie. So it's really worth thinking about that, because it's not the fact that it's organized that way, but it's the thinking that helps us to organize that way that maybe is the challenge. So I'd just like to take it away from financial services. And this is a video run by Metro Bank, who's a challenger bank in the UK. And they did this to start to look at what would happen if your pub, your local pub, was run like a bank. So I'm going to try again to go for the video option. Let me try.
Okay, number 57.
Can I have a decaf cappuccino, please?
You have to pop you on hold while I transfer you to the coffee department.
Hi there, how can I help?
She said she's put me through to the coffee department. I don't quite get it.
Coffee department, sorry, you got through to the lager department. Give me a minute.
No?
Would you like to make an application for some food or drink today? I just need the first line of your address and your mother's maiden name.
What?
I'm just going to pop you on hold while I transfer you to the wine department. Is that okay?
Double of about a 7 and Coke, please.
Oh, blimey, that's completely on my reach. I'll put you on hold for that one, okay? We reserve the right to cancel your fish and chips without prior notification. However, if you do not notify us in writing...
Business is important to us.
Hi there, what can I get you? Thank you very much, that's £5.
Cappuccino's £5.
£6, increased charges. Certainly, that'll be £100 of unnecessary charges.
Oh, how much? For a wine and what?
Yeah, so it's £6 for the wine, and then the rest is unnecessary charges.
No.
I'm afraid I can't accept your payment at the moment.
I'll get you in a minute. I'm going to pull you over the bar. We both over there having a conversation.
I can put you onto our conversation department.
Awful.
Yeah, it was awful, yeah.
Eventually I felt a bit angry and I wanted to give up.
Wherever you go, if you pay for a service and it was bad, you wouldn't go back. The service was absolutely terrible, and I thought I'd never come back again.
Thank you for your custom today. Would you mind taking a short survey? Your feedback is so important to us.
Thank you.
So I hope you're all back and can hear me.
Yep.
Good. So although that hopefully made you smile, because it never stops me from smiling every time I see it, it sort of indicates that the way that we design services it can be quite different, but it's driven by our thinking about what good and bad looks like. So as you look at that pub example, actually it probably resonates from a number of different service providers. So, you know, when I think about some of the experiences I have with banks or with mobile phone providers, or indeed insurance, they certainly hit a number of those buttons. But the thing for me is, why does that happen? So there's two models that are really important from a systems thinking perspective. And this is probably the first one. So in the pub example, in the system, we could see pints chained up. We could see scripts. We could see people having to pass over because they weren't trained. And you could start to see, hopefully, some of the frustration with the staff that only been able to do things, but certainly the frustration with our customers. And also the fact that there's probably quite a lot of cost being driven into that system because we've organised it that way. So normally what I've observed, at least in our organisation, is that often you go through this single loop. So we're all really keen to keep busy and to improve the system, but we tend to get caught in this single loop of how do we do it better and faster. We never really take the chance to step back and go, actually, what's the thinking that's driving this? And probably better questions about, well, why do we do it at all? Why do we think that will work? And that's a really critical part of system thinking. So if the system we've talked about, looking end to end and understanding, the thinking part is the second most important thing. Because leadership and work design isn't thousands of years old. It's been a choice that we made relatively recently. So pre the Industrial Revolution, somebody might want something, they'd go to a workman and they'd say, can I have this? He would do the work and he would give it to them at the end. But as we went through the Industrial Revolution, we came up with this idea. I think Adam Smith was the economist at the time, working with ladies' hat pins. So hat goes on the head and they put a pin through so it doesn't blow away. And it's on the back of a £20 English note. That this idea of the division of labour and the massive increase in efficiency as a result. So he worked out, if you chop the work up, have one person cutting the thing, another one sharpening and tempering it, another one cleaning it and putting it in packaging, actually you get a much greater efficiency through that process. So they started to divide the work up, and then as that grew, things started to happen. So my observation of working in any team who's part of the system is the first time they get work given to them from somebody else, the first thing they do is open the file and they check it. So in our world, that can be quite a long time because we have some big files, if you imagine, claims. So they'll look at it and they'll check that it's right, and then they'll do their little bit and they'll move it on to somebody else. But the measures that tend to get created in systems like this don't actually relate to the whole system. They relate to, well, how many things have you cut? They tend to relate to how many things have you then tempered, or how many things have you polished. So they relate to the parts of the system, not the whole. And they tend to relate to things that are either related to the person in the system or the operational metrics about what they're doing. So therefore, when we put leaders above that, they tend to have measures, and they tend to act on the operational measures and the measures that tell them people are good or bad. So people are doing the right thing or not doing the right thing. But in all of that, the very nature of that, sight of the system itself is lost. So nobody knows what quality looks like in that system because everyone's worried about their bit. So they tend to then have external quality teams that then look at, are we hitting quality? But again, the measures for the quality are people are good or people are bad, and they followed the process or they haven't followed the process. It doesn't tend to relate to have we actually achieved the outcome that's right for customers. And probably the bit at the bottom is the bit that I've learned most in the last 12, 18 months, is that the measures then that we use to improve work tend to happen in support functions where by their very nature, they tend to be away from the customer at the point of interaction and away from the work. And because the measures that we tend to pay attention to relate to operational people, we then tend to design solutions that are in that context. And therefore, they end up being more and more assumptive. So we see analysis rather than synthesis data. We're not always encouraged to look for synthesis. So therefore, we tend to fill managers' time and effort up all day long doing things that probably, when you look at it, you don't want them doing, because they're not actually helping you as an organisation achieve purpose. They're helping you do things around quality or do things around make people better. And we'll come back to measures later, but often that has very little to do with the achievement of purpose from a customer point of view. So all it's doing is adding cost and distracting them away from what really needs to be done. And the other side of that is from a change perspective, the change stack is often full. But when you sit back and look at it from a system perspective, most of the change would never shift the dial on performance because it's aimed at optimizing a part of the system. So the job of system thinking is anything apart from process, really. So when I work with leaders at any level, the first thing that I always talk to them about is the method of work, the redesigning the work using the method is really simple. It's like shooting fish in the barrel often, because you just look at the world with a slightly different lens and it's really easy to change. But actually the difficult thing is creating sustainability and scalability. So that requires us to look at measures, and measures not just for the front line, but for the whole organization and at every single level. And therefore you need to start thinking about roles in the organization. Because if roles in the organization relate to count the number of widgets, manage the number of widgets, people are the problem, then you're always going to be working on just doing more of the same. Actually, what we need is fundamentally to start changing our thinking about how work works for customers. So this is probably the second and most important model that Vanguard use. So they call it purpose, measure, method. So you should always begin with purpose, and that purpose should be the customer purpose. So in a claims system, for example, where we work, it might be get me back to normal and protect my interest. So that would mean, how do I get somebody back on the road, and how do I make sure that the third party isn't trying to take them to the cleaners? But then what matters to them, which we'll talk about again in a minute, might be, but I want it done quickly, and I want it done with as little effort from my perspective as possible. So armed with purpose and what matters from a customer perspective, you can start to build measures. And again, one of the big pieces of learning for me is how many measures exist in the organization, but how few of them really relate to purpose, or what we'd call lead measures. But armed with purpose and measures, then and only then can you really start to worry about method. So have we really thought about how we're trying to achieve purpose by applying method? More often, what happens is we start to worry about measures or method. So for example, we have our claims director. So our claims director was really, really frustrated that despite lots of really great things he was doing with his people, they were always, when you ask them what does a good day look like, talking about clearing all my activities, not about helping customers or settling claims, which is what the purpose on the wall would have been at the time. So what we did was we worked with him to take him into work to understand, well, what are the measures that people have and what's the method? So in this case, the actual physical IT that they use. And what became apparent really quickly from looking at that was A, the measures related to moving widgets, and B, the method, the system that they had, the IT, related to moving work to people in a functional model. So when you look at the measures and the method, actually that created a de facto purpose that was competing with what we were actually setting out to do. So far from the, help customers, look after customers, get them back to normal and look after their interests, what we were seeing was the de facto purpose for our teams was just survive the day, just clear your widgets and not have too many things outstanding. So it's really, really important, this connection between purpose from a customer perspective, building measures, and then worrying about method finally. And that's whether you're working with the CEO of the group, whether you're working with the CEO of your business unit, whether you're working with a team leader, but also from the team's perspective. How do we get the people who do the work connected to purpose, measures, and method? Does anyone have any questions? Because I'm going to sort of move on to some of the more practical how, but at that level, are there any questions? Is there anybody out there?
Yes,
right,
I'm here.
I'm Doctor, still there. Cool. Excellent. Yeah. Do you want me to just keep going?
I think so. Yes, please.
Yeah.
No,
Yeah.
okay. So I'm just going to try and take some of our logic. So we talked about this about thinking. So I just want to take a few of the thinking components and just probably do some little activities just to try and show you how we might look at the world slightly differently. And I think some of this might be similar to lean. But So we look at the world when we understand demand. So for a transactional system of, can I have a quote? Can I buy a policy? Can I make a claim? Those are all things that we would call value demands. So they're the reason the system exists. That's what customers want, and that's value. But then we look at things called failure demand. So where is my quote? I called yesterday, but I haven't heard yet. How do I open my online documents? So that we can start to identify, maybe all demand isn't work to be done. Maybe we should be thinking about what type of demands sit in the system, and actually how do we satisfy value demand, and how do we start to engineer out failure demand by doing value work. So this really came home to me when I met a guy who ran mortgage business for one of the big banks in the UK. So he had a team of people who would answer calls from mortgage brokers, and they'd be constantly calling them, and they'd be growing and growing and growing the team as demand grew. So it got to the point where the manager was saying, well, we're going to have to change and build yet another site now, but that's ridiculous. So I know what I'll do. I'll build an online tracking system for our mortgage brokers so they can see where they are. They spent about £8 million, I think he said at the time, building an online journey. But what do you think happened to demand? So far from actually reducing, what happened was it was increasing. And the reason it was increasing was, if you go back to purpose, the purpose of the system from the mortgage broker's perspective or from their customer's perspective was, my customer's moving home on Friday. I need to have knowledge of the mortgage in place before then so they can move home. So that's the purpose. But what we were doing by externalizing the system was just telling them there's no hope of the system giving them what they need for their customer. So we couldn't do what they needed. So therefore we were starting to generate more and more failure demand, because what we've done is industrialize then the mortgage broker saying, if I need this, I'm going to need to chase that person. So demand was actually going up. Once they'd actually done some demand analysis to understand the demand was, I need it by Friday, I need it by Tuesday, I need it by Wednesday, and worked out that their 5-day SLA or 7-day SLA, whatever it was never going to achieve happy customers. So they focus on the problem at hand, which is, if the value demand is I need a quote by a certain date, how do I reconfigure my design of my service to deliver on that date? Then, of course, the demand completely dropped away. So that must have been a really interesting conversation to say, sorry, boss, you know the £8 million I spent, we don't need it anymore. But it starts to help look at the world slightly differently. So if we just look at the all demand as work to be done, we worry about call answer rates, we worry about average handling times, because we want to make sure we will answer all demand. And of course, they're important to answer customer calls. But maybe a much better question is, how much of that demand is demand one? And how do we make sure that we're doing value work only? So the next one then, I think, just takes it on a little bit further. So from an engineering perspective, there's a guy called Taguchi, I believe, who did some work around this point. It wasn't what matters, it was perfect from an engineering perspective. And he proved mathematically and with lots and lots of study that the further away you get from perfect, the more it costs you. So if you're manufacturing ball bearings and they're slightly too small, they rattle around, they cause call-out charges, they cause more wear on the system. If you manufacture ball bearings that are too big, they get stuck, they cause wear inside the system. You get the idea. So the further away from perfect you get, the more it's going to cost you. And the same is true in service systems. So when you think about a service system, what sets that perfect has to be the customer. And I don't mean as homogenous groups at this point, I mean that customer. So if the customer sets what matters, then as further away you move from what matters, the more it's going to cost you. So taking that back to the previous slide of, we have value demands and we have failure demands. If you don't do what a customer wants in the time they want it to, you don't do enough, what happens? They might leave you, they might call you several times, they might email you, they might make complaints. All of that, you can see, starts to generate more cost in the system. And often we take one demand and we turn it into several because of that. But the same is true if you over contact them. So I remember an example of a previous organization where we had NPS feedback, so customer feedback. We weren't keeping them informed often enough. So we went top down. We're not keeping customers informed often enough. So everyone needs to go out and talk to customers and keep them informed. So when you've got a fragmented supply chain and lots of teams internally, that actually means you're talking to the customer many times. So there's a cost to that in terms of operational. But from a customer perspective, they think we've turned into stalkers. They think we're trying to talk to them every few seconds about things that don't matter to them. Because it matters to us to get an NPS score, but what matters to the customer might be just fix my car, and I don't need to know anything else. But this idea of every time you move away from what matters, it's going to cost you money, is really critical in service design. So to think of it in another way, we tend to manage by standardization. We tend to manage by SLAs, service level agreements, which create these standard processes. So we think of each customer going through customer demand process outcomes. We think about the process that we sit there and imagine designed to absorb that. What happens is that what matters for customers vary greatly. So they're not all rectangular, they come in all different sizes and shapes. And when they hit our process, which is designed for rectangular, that's when you start to see all of those unintended consequences. So you might see calls starting to rise. You might see customers starting to leave. But these are all things about the fact that we've tried to design a system that works for us to be efficient without understanding this concept of cost is in flow in the system. It's not in operational efficiency through economies of scale. So understanding the cost in flow, which is why we start with customer and look across the system to understand, well, how many times is work bouncing between different teams? How many times are we passing it back to customers? How many times are we actually fully resolving the customer demand on first contact is really important, because it tells you where your standardization doesn't work, and it helps you understand that cost so you can imagine a different world, which is radically different to how we might currently try and control cost. So if we take the demand, fix my machine, and look at this concept of what matters. So person one might be a professional. My washing machine's broken. Can you fix it as soon as possible? You know, maybe they're home every few days. Maybe they've got a load of stuff ironed, ready to go. So that if they lose their washing machine for a day, 2 days, it's not the end of the world. Versus person two, which is my washing machine's broken, it's giving off electric shocks. I've got a number of young children. Have you ever seen how much washing young children generate? And the fact that if it's giving off electric shocks, I'm worried about the safety of my children and the fact that I cannot survive without a washing machine. You don't understand. If I don't have a washing machine, that's the end of my life. So it's exactly the same demand. And we would look at it that way often from an insurance point of view when you look inside out. You just look at that and say, well, the demand is fix my machine. So we'll come up with a process to fix my machine. But actually, on that example, what you can see is as soon as you can is miles different to when I want it and safety. And if you design a system that can respond to as soon as I can, and you can design a system that then says, when do you want it? I need it by 3 o'clock today. Okay, by 3 o'clock today. And that reassures on safety. You're going to end up with two really happy customers on both example. But ignoring what matters will drive, again, a lot of this, what we call the failure demand or waste in the flow of the system. So the next lens I wanted to wear was another one of the big parts that I've already started to tease about, which is that performance is down to people. And again, this is one of the big thinking things that we're all taught and believe by the way that we build current systems and the way that we think about how we run performance management. But for a second, I'd just like to think about a system which is not dissimilar to how we might run a home emergency service. So a customer calls in with a valid demand. Can you fix my washing machine? And they talk to the contact center, and the contact center fills out a work order. The work order goes to Bob. I like Blackadder, so I use Bob. And Bob then goes and visits the customer and solves their problem. That's our logical flow. But of course, you'll know in organizations, we can never do anything simply. So as the work order goes out, we send a message to parts so that they can get the parts in the van for Bob when he goes. We'll send it to scheduling so that they can make sure we're sweating our assets well. We're getting our pound of flesh from Bob, that we're getting as many visits as possible. And then he's got his manager who's going to talk to Bob about performance management. So in that system, what sort of information do you think is being passed to the manager, and what sort of targets? So for parts, it's likely to be cost. And for scheduling, it's going to be something like number of number of visits per day. So what tends to happen is the performance management between Bob and the manager tend to come down to number of visits per day. And from studying our supply chain, I absolutely can tell you that that's true in our world, that despite all the good work that might happen elsewhere, when you hit the person who can solve customers' problems, they tend to be driven that way. So if we set Bob a target of, let's say, 5 visits per day, just have a think for a couple of seconds about what might stop Bob from achieving 5 visits a day. Maybe just write down a few ideas, and I'll give you just a couple of minutes. I've changed the target. I've made it quick in a couple of minutes. So I'm going to guess now that the sorts of things you're going to come up with are things like traffic, or the job order was wrong, or on his van he had the wrong tools, or the weather, or the car ran out of fuel or broke down. So if you run that with any group of people, you'll see a whole long list of things. And we'll call them system conditions, things that influence the performance of the system. Now, if you go against your list and try and work out what is it that's influencing the system here? Is it Bob, our engineer, or is it the system itself? Or even if you called it Bob or something else, and went down each of your items and start to just think about, what is it, Bob or the system? And that's really important from my perspective, because having done this lots and lots and lots of times with teams, as you look at broader performance, not just about Bob, but talking about organizational performance, and you start to understand what's driving performance, when you go through that list, you very, very quickly realize that Bob has very little to do with performance of any of them. That if you put the wrong stuff in the van for Bob, or you train Bob wrong and send him out to a job that he's not able to do, that he can't control the weather, he can't control other things. These are things that can't work for Bob influencing it. These are things that are down to the system. So back to Deming, who has done this work along with a number of other people, have looked at what drives variation in performance in the system. And I think Deming said it was 97% of all variation of performance in a system is down to the system itself. So that means only 3 to 5% might be down to the individual. So if you think about your organizations from that perspective, how much of your manager's time is spent trying to improve the individual versus understanding that performance is down to the system, and actually spends time improving the system of work?
It's quite scary to think about that, isn't it?
But honestly, every time we've gone through it and looked at those system conditions, it just never is the person. Of course, you do get the odd bad apple. But again, if you design the system based on trust, can you get much better outputs from the system? So I just want to get a little bit geeky for a little bit, but I won't go too much. I've got someone in my team who does this and has done it for 12 years and has done it globally for a very large organization. So I'm giving you a third-hand view. But let's think about those visits and Bob. So what's the boss saying? So day one, he's got a target of 8 visits per day. He's saying, brilliant, Bob, carry on like this, you'll be employee of the week. Day 2, when Bob's only managed to do 4 visits, and the manager's thinking, oh, I better have a word with Bob. Bob, what's going on? Bob, you need to pull your socks up for tomorrow. So tomorrow comes along, day 3, and he's done 7. Well, you know, as a manager, I must have really made a difference to Bob. He was 4 yesterday, he's 7 today. I've done a great job. And day 4 comes along and it's 2, and again, the end of the world. You're on a warning there, Bob. But you get this concept of point-to-point data really isn't helpful, at least in my perspective. But yet, a lot of the reporting that you see is driven around point-to-point data, day to day, person to person, last month to this month. And it talks about point-to-point data, and we look at it surprised as though it's good or bad. Now, if you plot that, you can see why, actually, in this distribution, 8 seems to be, you know, a reasonable stretch target, doesn't it? When I look at it, I think, well, he's obviously done it a few times. We must be able to do that. But if the system delivers you an average of 6, then all of a sudden 8's a bit interesting, because you know on average it's going to be 6. So how's Bob ever going to achieve 8? So then if we use some statistical controls around it, and we start to understand the upper and lower control limits, which tell you that the likelihood of 11.5 or whatever it is, and half, is exactly the same as it is 6, and exactly the same as each other, then in that system, as you receive a day and try and get around somebody, the likelihood of him doing none or the likelihood of him doing 12 are exactly the same. And the average is 6. So if you start to say to Bob, I want you to now deliver 8, what can Bob do? The system, predictably, and this is stuff that's based around the 97%, delivers you 6. Yet we've said to Bob we want him to do 8 because we put a stretch target in. The only thing that Bob can do is cheat. And you see this in the papers, and if you look, you'll see it in your organisations, if they're anything like what we've looked at today. So I don't mean viciously cheat, but they will cheat the system. So we might have somebody who goes along to look at a customer's carpets to see if it's repairable or needs replacing, and they'll turn up and they'll go, I've been allowed 15 minutes for this visit, but the work order said it was 1 room and it's actually 3 rooms. So they can't do it. So they'll phone back to head office and say, the job's not right on the spec, what do you want me to do? Do you want me to stay on this job or move on? But the point being that whole point around the number of calls per day and designed around achieving it calls people to do all sorts of things. So other people would just come up to the customer and go, oh, I'm sorry, my sheet says it's 1 room and it's 3. You'll need to reorganise to come back. Or we'll not quite make sure we understand what matters to the customer, and we won't quite do things that will stop failure demand repeating and hitting the organisation again, because we're trying to survive in the system that's been created. Does that make sense? Because out of all the bits of thinking, that's probably the hardest one, or the last one that people really buy into. They tend to have lots of nagging doubts about, surely it must be the person.
Yeah, I think it does. Thank
No,
you.
it makes sense. Yeah, absolutely.
Cool.
Can I ask a well, maybe
please do.
Comment rather than a question? But so and it's not that I disagree with the point. I agree it's the system. I guess I look at that data slightly differently. So I'm looking at that and looking at percentiles rather than averages and sigma variations. I think you've got 12 data points. So I think 6 of those data points, so 50% of the data points are 7 visits or above. So I'm looking at that and saying there's a 50% chance of doing 7 visits. So the 50th percentile is slightly different from the average. So then you'll be kind of interesting to look at what the percentile coverage is. So what percentage chance have you got of doing 8 visits a day, which again is a systemic thing, doesn't kind of negate your point in any way. It's just a different way of looking at that data.
Yeah, and I might not have plotted it correctly either because I did it on a graph, but the point being that if variation is normal, the average would be the average. And actually, if as an organisation you're paying attention to any of that, that's probably not helpful. It's probably consuming capacity in that system, and it may not be actually anything to do with the individual data points. So improving that system would require you, wouldn't it, to look at the whole system?
Right. Yeah.
Rather than taking account of any individual points.
Yeah, it's still if we want to do 10 days in a higher percentage of time, yeah, what in the system is stopping us doing that, and we change the system. Yeah, I totally agree with that. Yeah.
So there are some data rules as well which you apply to that, aren't there? But and so I've used, again, this is another one of Deming's points, in any system. So don't forget, the system there's more than one part, they're interdependent, and the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. But in any system, variation is normal. And I guess I don't need to tell you as a group about that, but he did a thing called the funnel experiment. So he took a marble and he dropped it down a funnel and it landed on a piece of paper, and he marked where it landed. So on the first table there, you can see normal variation. So the where it hits the piece of paper is spread out, but it's relatively controlled. It's in a stable system. Now, he did 2 or 3 experiments. The one on the right was literally, as I drop it down, if it doesn't hit perfect to center, I move the funnel to go over the last point. And then what you can see there is, actually, by trying to take action on things that were normal and predictable, you made the system worse. And in this circumstance, it made it 40% more variation, as the dots can show. In some of the other examples, he did midway and other things that stretched it out. But this point of how many times do we see single data, you know, last month or this month's got worse than last month, and everyone then spends time worrying about how do I fix that problem. But often that's then just normal variation, which from my perspective, you should just ignore. And I only say ignore as in don't knee jerk. So back to my thinking system performance, taking action on that one is just going to loop you around in that single loop, that I must fix something. It's not going to get you to the point of it's normal and predictable. If I don't like the overall performance, I need to take action on the system. And again, I think this is your point as well. So often in our world, in engineering, you wouldn't, I'm sure, but we'll often look at a couple of data points, and we'll pat ourselves on the back and we'll tell ourselves more work to be done, or it's gone brilliant. So, you know, the turnaround, the bounce back, we might call them all different sorts of things. But actually, are any of those a signal to take action? And that's a really important point. So if you had a coin and you flipped it 22 times, what would be the probability of it being 3 or more heads or tails in a row? And the answer is, it's something like 99.994% probable, which if you were a betting man, would be a pretty good bet. So in variation in a system, actually 2 or 3 data points above or below the mean do not make it a trend. They're just normal variations still. So it's not until you get to those 7 or 8 data points in a row that it becomes really important, because that tells you something is systematically happening. Something is changing in that system. So system thinking...
Can I just interject there?
Yes, please do.
I think you're simplifying a statistical analysis a little bit too much.
Okay.
Those of us who've been working with neural networks and things like that to look at trends using multi-layer perceptrons or other neural networks like coherent networks to look for patterns. You can get far more information. This is why IBM has made a fortune out of IBM Algo and things like that. Analyzing data that you've got isn't about just looking at points like this. It's a little bit more complex, especially when you have thousands and thousands of records coming through. So I think you've got to be a bit careful about how you look at statistics the way you're looking at them. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, I think you've got to be very careful with that. Okay.
So, just from my perspective, in a service organisation, which is what we're talking about here, it really is important to understand what are the signals to act and what aren't. If you've got comfort that through analysis and synthesis, looking at it, that it's helpful, then I'd agree, keep going with whatever method you've got. From our perspective, that most of my team have spent 10, 12 years doing this. These are some of the broadest challenges that we see in service systems, people mistaking the wrong things. So I'm not trying to describe statistics for neural networks or anything like that, but this is what we've taught leaders to do and pay attention to in systems.
Well, that's what I'm trying to get to. You're not actually describing a proper trend.
Sorry, so
what you're showing is an indicator.
In terms of
what is
7 data points in a row above or below the...
Yeah, 7 data points in a row doesn't necessarily make a trend.
Which is why you've got to do the synthesis as well, go and look and make sure you understand why it's happening.
Okay, sorry, I just wanted to interject that, you know, as you say, I know you've been using your system for 10, 12 years. From something that I've applied my trend analysis to things like Tesco's since 1999 and some other customer services to 7 banks, we've actually worked out that you have to be very, very careful what you call a trend and what you call an indicator.
Fantastic. Sounds like you've got a lot more knowledge.
Okay. Sorry, I didn't want this is not a pissing match, by the way. This is just an explanation. Yeah.
Yeah, no, and obviously we use lots and lots of data in financial services. But so let me just carry on. So
please carry on.
From our perspective, this is one of the cool things about capability charting, that understanding normal and predictable isn't an indicator to do something unless there's a trend. And actually, from a change perspective, as the system changes, if you understand the data, you can see that change relatively quickly. So back to the way that systems thinking works, with study, with then experiment, roll in and make normal. This tells us very, very quickly if a change is changing the broader system. Now, it needs to relate to the right measures, but capability charting for us is a really, really powerful way of looking at, are we really making a difference to an end-to-end customer journey? And again, an example there, which is a real example. So having gone from a leader with a 14-day average around doing something, which he was quite happy with, we went through using data to this one, which is a case level data, which showed the reality for customers was it's not 14 days, it's up to 45. But the averages that were being used were showing it was somewhere between 14, and even applying upper and lower control limits was I think 11 to 21 days was normally predictable. But again, taking it back to case level helped us understand exactly what was going on. So when we looked at the points that were higher up, we learned some things about the system. So they tended to be things that weren't the responsibility of the director. So either they were vehicles damaged abroad, or they were ones that were going through a fraud process. But what we learned really quickly was that if you look at the cases along the middle and you look at the ones that are the vast majority, that there were 3 things predictably going wrong in the system. So we had the engineers process. So this was around total loss in vehicles. The engineers process was delaying decisions being made. And we had a supplier that we were using that were going through a process we'd given them that was predictably causing delays in certain types of cases. And we had another thing going on about a requirement for pictures in the process, which again was making it difficult for customers, but not adding any value. So again, this idea of how you use data from exec down to understand and take action to try and get people then to have the data, but to your point, to then understand from a synthesis point of view what's really going on is critical. I've then stolen unashamedly this theory of constraints, focus on flow. So again, when I think about it from an organizational dynamics perspective, in any system, unless you understand how work flows through the system, you tend to get odd behavior of the teams. So in this system here, they're producing trolleys. So team A can do 6 per hour, team B 4 per hour, team C 8 per hour, and team D 10 per hour. And you'll know from that the flow, the amount of widgets you can put at the end relate to 4, because B is your constraint. But it's the fact that in this system, most teams might have their own targets, and that the targets and the behavior of the leaders will fill up the change portfolio quite quickly. And therefore, unless you've got that view about how work flows, how much organizational effort goes on doing things that won't actually improve the system. So I'm going to try and just summarize, because I'm conscious that I said I'd be about an hour and leave a load of time for questions. So this might be a different way of looking at it, but in the current world, we tend to use experience, feedback, measures, and lots of opinions, complete with bias then, to make decisions, to create a to-be state. We then create plans, we launch different teams, we build measures, and we set targets and performance manage to make sure that we get what we want. But actually, what I've seen from the study work we've done is that the experience, feedback, and measures are often wrong, and they're wrong in the context of they don't tend to relate to the system, or they tend to relate to the wrong measures themselves. So they tend to relate to operational measures. So we tend to make decisions through the hierarchy and away from the work, which again drives that assumptive nature. And often the plans that we create, because it's assumptive and it's lined with people are the problem, tend to drive this thing called the de facto purpose. So we launch this to different teams because we wouldn't dare challenge the fact that the teams may not need to exist if you built it from a flow perspective. And the measures ignore variation over time. They don't relate to purpose or the wider system. So we assume, again, in the set targets and performance management, that the people are the problems. So we build the measures and we build the performance management system to make the people better in that system. So maybe if that's creating problems in the current system, maybe the difference to that is decisions based on data. And by data, I do mean that analysis based upon system-wide data, based around purpose and what matters from a customer, but also based around that look, that synthesis that you get from actually studying the work, so that we make decisions in the work and that we encourage everyone to come into work to improve the system. That we study, experiment, roll in and make normal rather than worry too much about what we want it to look like. We base everything around reality. That we accept that for some change it's emergent and we don't need to plan for everything. Sometimes planning takes a lot of time, effort and energy, and actually that's time, effort and energy you could be being used to actually improve the system. That we build customer in and we deliver as near to the customer as possible, which really challenges you to think about how do we organise our support services and how much of the support service is really aligned to customer purpose. We build measures that relate to purpose and what matters from a customer perspective. And as I said before, if you can get everyone focused on improving the system as part of their day job, you can make some quite transformational leaps. That was the end of my whistle-stop tour of systems thinking. So I guess over to you. Any questions?
I'm happy to get going. So thank you, Jason. Obviously, I'm aware that you've been to lots of different companies and looked at systems thinking alongside lots of your team. But I guess it must be really tricky when you're going in and you're sort of working with these line managers that have always been sort of very target heavy, driving targets through their team. How do you try and help change that mindset for them, more away from the sort of target driven and looking more at the system? How do you sort of try and change that mindset for them?
That's a really great question, thanks Claire. And I guess it's exactly the same whether you're working with an exec director as it is with a team leader to an extent. You just get them to worry about different things. But as I said, John Seddon, who's the guy who started this stuff, he is a bit Marmite, but his background was occupational psychology. So part of systems thinking is what they call normative. So how do you get people to go study to understand the system they've created and thinking about actually what are the conditions that are driving that, and therefore what's the thinking? Because by doing that, they're able to accept and move much quicker into a new way. But you've also got to think about how you change the whole system, Claire. So it's all very well creating energy through change, but unless you get the leadership through the line and the measures plumbed in properly, then I think that the thing that I've seen is that it just goes backwards. You get pulled back by the wider system to go backwards. But if you can get it so that you spend time understanding the problem with them, and they're part of the co-creation of the solution, and then you can work with them about measures and their role to change that, then you've got a chance of making that sustainable.
Cool, thank you. So really bringing them on that journey.
Yeah, so you know, with a team, we might start with 4 to 6 weeks of study and make sure that we've got a cross section of people in there. So the manager, the leader that's going to lead the team, but mainly people who do the work, they can then really understand the system and they can help their colleagues. But even when we get to taking their colleagues through that, we don't do it as a rollout. It's always how do you roll them into what you've learned? How do you bring them in so that they go on that journey to understand it too?
Thank you.
Hi, Jason. Thank you. That was a really enjoyable and thought-provoking talk. I was thinking about the experimentation angle, and I just wondered, you know, do you tend to have small experiments running alongside the normal process how do you scale out the kind of learning and stuff like that? Where does it start?
Okay, that's a really great question again. So because it's not process, what we tend to do, we tend to take a team through that period of study and help them see the world differently. So through study, you're trying to build a really robust baseline of performance. You're trying to build absolutely understanding of what the system conditions are, but not to fix them per se, because that will be that single loop learning. You're trying to understand them so that when you get to redesign, you can work on a basis of if you just did value, would it make the rest of it irrelevant? So we go through that period, but the main reason of going through that period is that that's when you're re-chipping people, whichever way you want to call it. You're helping them change their thinking to look at the world differently. So when we get to experiment, we start with purpose, measure, to absolutely be clear that that's the way the team's going to work. And we work with the leader as well about changing the relationship with the team pretty much immediately. So then they'll identify, well, what does value look like from a customer perspective? So if I think about a previous organization I worked with, that if you wanted to order a piece of IT from a mouse to a server, you went through the same process. So as you study that system, what you see really quickly is the first thing up front is when you ask purpose, the leadership think it's save money and the people in the team think it's about provide excellent customer service. But you can start to see in all of that process, because it's driven by a purpose of save money, and it's driven by a top-down view of this is what you need to do to save money, everyone in that system was trying to do that. So it would go from a person who needs a mouse to do their job to the team leader. The team leader would fill it in, it would go to the manager. And at one point, it actually went to the head of to sign off because we were worried about capital cost. So it all went through that process. It then hit the general insurance side of the IT. And they went through a process of, do you need it? Have we got the money? It went over to finance. They asked, do you need it? Have we got the money? They'd be outbounding the customer to say, you sure you need it? Da, 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 da. They then hand it over to the part of the business that actually would fulfill the order. And it went through exactly the same stuff. You sure you need it? Have we got the money? Outbound calls, or we haven't got all the information, you need to start again, fill it in. And it went through to the person who actually delivered to them who would do that. So that really simple thing was a sort of a 57-step process. So if you start with the team saying, well, actually, let's not try and worry about improving the 57 steps. If we set some principles for how we want to work, and we understand purpose and what matters from a customer perspective, and we've got some decent measures built around that, then what would value look like from a customer perspective? And understand that customer journey of what does value look like, and only value. So it might be understand the problem, can you help, and give me the thing I want. It might be as simple as that. And then we would start the team building that out. But because we build it out with live work rather than theoretical work, as you take the first one, you'll work with the team and you'll learn loads. Well, that didn't work, that assumption was wrong, this did work. But then by the time you take case after case after case, what you're doing is slowly you're working out, what do I need to do to the system to allow it to absorb variation? So by the time you get to the end of that process, it's really quite quick, because you can take quite a few cases through, or at least in our system. And then what you do, you then go, well, I've got 4 or 5 people taking demand in this way, and I'm really happy I've got measures that tell me it's working really well, and I'm really happy that it's much, much better. So now how do I work out, how do I roll other people in, so I can test it at volume? So at that point, we might look at taking another 15, 20 people in, and working out from what you learned through your 6 weeks, how would you take these people through to understand? So that the team then build the rolling plans, and they build the method of work with the team leader around them to then take an extra 15, 20 people. At that point, for us, normally that's when you've got confidence that the experiment works and is scalable. And also you've worked out how you can roll other people in and learn through that process. And then you build out from that point. So you've got the data, you've got the numbers, you've got the measures built, you've got the approach for rolling, and you've got confidence that that's going to work. But often back to that point right at the beginning about process, measures, and role of leader, that is the most critical bit for me. The measures and role of leader is the bit that makes it work or not work. So if the role of leader, when you study it, for us, it is, they very rarely spend more than about 15, 20% of their time on purpose, as in helping to deliver customer purpose. Most of the time it's spent on doing things that are distractions. So you need to make sure you've got their leadership to turn off the distractions and understand systematically that it's not helping them, and redesign their work so they're in there helping their teams, and changing that basic relationship from you're the problem to it's a system. If you can get those 3 working well, then rolling tends to work really well. If you can't get them working really well, you end up getting the processy type benefits, but it tends to revert because you've not done enough to change thinking. So the next change comes along, doesn't come along in that ilk, it comes along with the old thinking, because it normally comes from outside that area. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. It does. I mean, I'm just, if I can kind of make sure I understood it, you essentially start with like this kind of focus on this, let's say 1 or 2 cases, and you keep applying a number of different scenarios to see how they fit in and kind of adapt as you go along. Is that right? And then you start to scale it after that.
So we always work in reality. We never work on opinions. Through study, through actual redesign, it's never assumptive. So we just take demand naturally as it hits the center, and as you build this piece of demand, so everything's taken randomly. We don't take anything based upon we'll just do this little bit, we'll just do that. It's just what comes through the door. What comes through the door from customers, can you deal with it? And if you can't, what needs to happen to design? So you build it really quickly based on real cases. And by the time you've gone through a number, what you learn pretty quickly is you can start to deal with all the demands coming through without having to amend it massively. Because it's not based on a controlling standardization at that point. What you're doing is saying the principles that you're working to and deliver value with the different measures help you take that demand. Because often what I've seen is that the reason people don't deal with the demand has got nothing to do with the fact that they can or can't. It's got to do with stuff that we've done, not intentionally, but done. so they can't possibly deal with that. They're not trained, but actually you learn pretty quickly. Well, actually, for the majority of demand, if you design against demand, they can take 90–95% of it, and you don't need any training at all. But again, back to this idea of if you don't know your pool support, rather than we'll beat you up. So you've got to create that surrounding system.
Brilliant. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Well, another quick one, Jason, just because I'm dying to know, not necessarily systems thinking related per se, but you showed us the video of the pub from Metro Challenger Bank. Now I'm dying to know, are they way better at how they operate compared to all the other banks? Because I just don't know. I've heard of them, but I've never sort of walked into a branch or anything. Have they nailed it?
I haven't, and I don't know what method they've used, so I honestly don't know. What I do know is First Direct was originally built using systems thinking. So before it went into the other banks, the bigger bank and got bought out, it was designed using systems thinking. So that was one of John Seddon's first pieces of work back in the late 80s, early 90s. So it gives you an idea about how you can create service differently at that level.
Okay, interesting.
I would say that anything operating like a pub must be happy. Having fun.
Well, the outcome may be great.
The outcome is great. It's a great flow there.
My answer to that is, what's a pub?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Yeah, forgotten.
We haven't seen one of those for many months now.
A pub is what I have in one of my rooms. It's drawers and tables and cabinets full of all sorts of liquor. That's the pub.
Sounds fabulous to me.
Oh, brilliant. Are there any final questions there? No. Oh, well, thank you so much, Jason, for your time. That was really insightful.
You're more than welcome.
I'm definitely going to go away questioning myself what matters to the customer. I'm going to chant that like a mantra over, I think, the next few weeks. So thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thanks very much for your time, guys.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thank
you,
you.
everyone.
Bye.
Fantastic. Thank you.